Greetings and welcome to the channel. It is July in San Francisco, and I'm wearing a big wool sweater. Maybe I don't hate cold weather. Maybe I just hate seasons in San Francisco. Instagram used to be fun, right? It was like Twitter for your photos. It's 2012. You're wearing your brand new Chuck Taylors, headed to the thrift store to find a new used cardigan or corduroy pants probably, when you think, my friends would surely be interested in seeing this, and you snap a photo of your feet. A work of art. Now, almost 15 years later, it's full of celebrities embarrassing themselves and cute animal accounts and 3-month-old memes from TikTok. I think we can all agree it's lost its way, but for a brief period it had a certain charm because it did one thing. Let you share spontaneous moments and add a filthy, heavy-handed, and absolutely grody filter to all of your photos. Sadly, those two have fallen out of fashion and sit neglected now at the bottom of your screen, waiting to be selected and applied with nuance. Perfection. Now that I'm basically middle-aged, I catch myself reflecting on the past. I don't mean the simpler times, the 1950s or the 1830s, but without all the racists and getting married off for the highest bid. I had to sing it because I'll get a copyright if I just cut to the music video. I mean the 2010s, when iPhones were still in the single digits and social media didn't consist mainly of doxing and cyberbullying and misinformation like how you should use potato juice to cure strep throat. Don't do that. A time where Facebook wasn't filled with AI-generated images of shrimp Jesus and Instagram was still used to share glorious 720p photos with filters that bordered on vintage parody. Those were formative years for me that I can no longer access because I've deleted my Instagram multiple times throughout the years to purge my grid of horrible, embarrassing burrito pics and drunk selfies. But this is what defined Instagram. A poorly composed photo of your dog that looked like a Polaroid that had been fermenting in the attic of an octogenarian shut-in for several decades. Peak technology. I don't know when our fascination with retro design and aesthetics first began, but I remember being obsessed with 80s fashion and music in the 2000s. In the 2010s, it felt like we went back even further by reviving 60s and 70s trends, going so far as to try and recreate the music of the era, but then accidentally just created swag rock. Gen Z is now really into 90s and Y2K fashion like chokers and jean co's, I think. I honestly can't keep track, and I don't really care. I'm not gonna shame them. Every generation goes through a vintage revival period, after all. When I was their age, we started buying vinyl records and were wearing baseball tees and western shirts and flower crowns like a bunch of fucking hippies.
Fucking hippie motherfuckers.
It was all documented with analog photography or a crude facsimile of it. The amount of people I knew who had a Polaroid camera purchased from Urban Outfitters was staggering, the go-to retailer for all things kitsch and hip. Is that an oxymoron? Can those two things exist at the same time? You can go anywhere without running into someone lugging one around, snapping novelty mini Instax that would immediately get lost. People got so into retro photography, myself included, that there was a run on specific era-appropriate SX70 Polaroid film because you could manipulate the photo after developing and create a painterly effect by mushing the emulsion around inside. It was so expensive at the time because it was discontinued in 2008, but was then brought back to life by the Impossible project shortly after. I don't know if anyone else remembers this, but Impossible was folded into Polaroid, who then hired Lady Gaga as their creative director in 2017. What the fuck does she know about film manufacturing? 2 years after Polaroid stopped making the one thing they're known for, Instagram came out, and we no longer needed to buy film that cost $20 for 8 photos. I mean, they kept making instant film, it was just considered inferior and was still just as expensive for some reason. I think it was 600 film, Polaroid 600 was the cheap knockoff stuff? Don't quote me on that. It was serendipitous that Instagram launched when there was a renewed interest in vintage and retro photography. It filled a void in our collective yearning for a specific aesthetic with built-in filters that replicated the same vintage feel. Looking back 14 years later, they were probably a bit much, where each filter had varying amounts of sepia, vignetting, and contrast, and the occasional light leak bloom, and faux film mats. But it was also a fun novelty that let you express yourself in what felt like a personal way, even if it was ugly. Editing photos was easier than ever for the layman or photography initiate. One of the biggest problems with photography, and honestly most forms of art in general, is their exclusivity and gatekeeping. Photography is probably one of the most expensive forms of art, where cameras and editing software can cost thousands of dollars, not to mention the cost of developing and printing and framing. If you don't have the right equipment, you're not considered a real photographer by a lot of other shitty photographers. From personal experience. In a lot of ways, Instagram democratized photography, allowing everyone to try their hand at it, becoming digital non-Goldens, photographing our benders and justifying it by saying we were documenting the experiences for posterity, man. But it also led to a lot of folks who lacked self-restraint to crank the effect slider all the way up on their photo of a pan of nachos, making them look more like what happens in your toilet 4 to 6 hours after you eat them. Instagram filters were a way for pretty much anyone to express themselves quickly and easily without needing to be an expert in Photoshop or Lightroom or color theory or the rule of thirds or the golden ratio or leading line. However, the fact that there were only about 12 presets meant every photo shared looked like the same orange blob of nothing, a strange phenomena that did the opposite of what filters were meant to achieve. Photos became less unique because of this Instagramification, not more. Obviously, it didn't help that everything became photo-worthy for many years simply because everyone had a camera in their pocket now. With 5 million users and 100 million photos being uploaded by 2011 alone, tropes began to emerge. Overhead coffee photos, food photos, abandoned buildings, and so many photos of shoes. Why were we doing that? Filters were supposedly used to elevate all of these boring snapshots into art because people thought that vintage or retro meant good and artistic. All these filters really did was cover up the terrible quality of early smartphone cameras, and even then, only marginally? Maybe? These old photos were just precursors to deep-fried memes before they even existed. Seriously, look at this sunset. You can almost hear it sizzling. And the human brain can't comprehend what's happening in some of these, and everyone looked like they had jaundice for like 4 years. To be fair, early Instagram users were still figuring out how best to use the app and what its limitations were, and it would take a while before we all started showing a little self-control when editing our photos. It's a real shame too, because these memories that were captured in picture form are blurry beyond recognition or completely blown out that make your eyes water if you stare at them for too long. All those moments, lost in time, like tears in the rain.
Time to die.
Before I continue, the irony is not lost on me that this is the second video I've made with a vintage cinema aesthetic using faux film grain and film mats and titles inspired by 60s and 70s movies. I am aware that it could be seen as hypocritical to talk about old Instagram filters that were meant to recreate a clumsy vintage feel in 2010 while basically doing the same thing in this very video. I think I've been pretty measured and have shown some restraint that was almost non-existent back then. It's honestly just a coincidence that while I was writing this script, I also started rethinking the branding of the channel. I was, initially going for an 80s VHS look and had been leaning into that more up until recently, but I was never really dedicated to it or liked it all that much either, and decided to go a different route, especially when I noticed several other creators going down that same evocative direction. I went a different way to avoid seeming like I was biting their style, but still wanted to differentiate my channel and content and create a visual language that felt more me while not being distracting. I hope it's not distracting. Implementing a visual language by adding filters or effects isn't always a bad thing, nor is it always pretentious. It's how you use them and what the intent is behind their use. I just don't want my videos to feel like a Grindhouse movie at the end of the day. That's kind of bare minimum for me, that they don't feel like Planet Terror or some shit. I think my application lends a certain tone that honestly I can't even fully articulate, and I only wanted to address it in case anybody watching this was thinking, hey, he's literally doing the same thing. I know. I mean, shit, I'm proof that people never really even stopped using these filters. We just got better photo editing software and apps. Shortly after Instagram came out, we got things like Visco and Hipstamatic and countless gimmick apps like Pocket Booth with its vintage-inspired photo booth interface. God, we've come a long way in UI design, huh? Eventually, we got more robust apps that made you feel like a real photographer by letting you access curves and color balance on your phone. Ooh. Oh my god, there's so many bugs in here. As smartphone camera quality improved and the first influencers were born, people began implementing an aesthetic, treating their grid as more of a brand with a visual identity rather than a place to post casual snapshots of the sun through a pint of beer, or this lamp. Instagram eventually incorporated all these standard adjustments where you could manipulate contrast, brightness, saturation, warmth, hue, and whatever the structure slider did. The app eventually allowed uploads of photos where brands and early influencers would post crisp images shot on a DSLR to create perfectly curated collages. People were still using the in-app camera to take spontaneous photos, but the popular accounts and photos that got a lot of engagement were from professionals who made small adjustments in Lightroom rather than slapping one of the built-in filters on a photo and calling it a day. This created an entire economy of buying and selling custom presets that were a bit more refined, but even still, kind of a lot with their pretentious and homogeneous look that made deeply calculated and inauthentic content. Gone was any sense of spontaneity, replaced with a color palette of complementary Pantone swatches. Back when the grid was the end-all be-all for influencers, these presets had the same effect on your eyes as the blown-out, oversaturated original Instagram filters did. Everything looked the same despite being objectively more appealing in order to cater to a wider audience. It's the same as the soulless corporate mid-century bohemian art you see at Target. It says nothing and means less. Old Instagram filters were messy to be sure, but at least they depicted an individual's life and tastes and interests they documented throughout the day despite the heavy-handed filtering. It had a certain charm and honesty to it. My back is killing me. Dude. The shift away from using the camera on your phone and adding a custom Lightroom preset to ensure complete conformity and continuity sucked the life out of the app, and more importantly, photography is an art form. Some of these boring influencers would go on to sell their presets for anywhere from $20 all the way up to $300, adding to the vast sea of repetitive content cloning that conform to the ever-growing desire to become an influencer by the general public and need to monetize every goddamn hobby. For anyone who hasn't seriously pursued photography like myself, photography can be a huge fucking hassle, and this type of content was extremely deceptive. These kinds of photos are all manufactured, and when I see a curated grid of posed portraits and still life couches and bathroom pictures, all I can think about is the hours it took to stage these setups and the probably hundreds of photos that were taken to get just one worthy of the all-important grid. When I was working as a semi-professional event photographer, I'd spend hours combing through hundreds of photos and then tweak each of the good ones so the color correction was consistent, and it was a pain in my ass. It takes hours to edit photos to all have the same exposure and contrast and color balance. Presets are only as good as the editor using them, and depending on the lighting or exposure or white balance or the location, you can't simply apply a preset and call it a day. They help with the tedium and get you close to a finished product, but you still have to tweak everything ever so slightly. And then you start to get visually fatigued, where the first edit ends up looking like the last, even if it's imperceptibly so, because is this one too dark, or is the hue too green? Am I going blind? It's why at this point I prefer film photography to digital. I don't have to think about it until it's developed, and then it is what it is, and I can go on living my life. I don't know why I like to edit videos. It's basically the same thing. A strange paradox we'll never have the answer to. For the most part, the novelty of Instagram filters and these influencer branded presets eventually wore off. Instagram became oversaturated with aesthetically pleasing content that lacked value, and eventually became a marker of vapid influencers selling flat tummy tea and other products that promoted unhealthy eating disorders. The pendulum then swung the other way, and there's been a rejection and demystifying of influencer content for several years now, replaced by unfiltered and unedited pictures and photo dumps that have become popular and the new norm to a certain extent. We did have to bear the continued use of way too many hashtags, including hashtag no filter for a while, but we eventually unlearned that habit when Instagram finally admitted that hashtags don't matter anymore. It's important to point out that the use of filters was a millennial thing, and as with any trend once considered cool by one generation, it's usually seen as lame and embarrassing by the following. Posting perfectly lit images, or even posting anything to your timeline at all, became cringe by Gen Z, and even younger millennials themselves. The rules of Instagram changed a lot in a short time, and was also probably a response to the overwhelming bombardment of sponsored content that incorporated this preset aesthetic. Pseudo-aspirational content was tiring, and younger users rebelled against the established norms by posting what's been deemed anti-aesthetic. Blurry club photos, a cat on a table, gutter water, and bug. We came full circle, just without the addition of filters, and it was refreshing to see creators unburden themselves from the pressure that their lives should be determined by a collage of photos that fit a certain style or color palette. You'll see lo-fi style images interspersed with studio quality photos taken by professional photographers that add an effortlessness to the ugly aesthetic. Or it's, professional photographers doing different styles. It's not just like one homogeneous thing. These blurry, messy, ugly photos convey a vibe that tells more of a story, and more importantly, are authentic, where you'll come across the odd Spotify screenshot or photos of art that were probably downloaded from a Google search. Maybe these are also manufactured, but they feel more real than this. The visual language of Instagram shifted to a moodiness, for lack of a better word, that feels more like a scrapbook compared to the manicured single image posts of 2014. And the hustle culture beast mode mentality, regularly being made fun of, was exacerbated by the inescapable influencer post a photo every day grind, an aesthetic that was being pushed on us, and the pressure to feed the algorithm. The trend toward decentering the ideal physical self or lifestyle on social media has created a new sense of ennui, a rejection of the visually appealing status quo, and a manifesto of the serenely divine messy mirror selfie. In many ways, this was the intended use of Instagram from the beginning. Honest snapshots of the real. Companies even picked up on it and tried to redefine the photo-sharing social media platform, but then missed the mark by like a mile because they kept interrupting us with a notification telling you it's time to be real, man. Take your selfie. God, this one bug, man. Early Instagram filters were used to hide the low quality of smartphone cameras, and once the hardware caught up to the software, filters entered obsolescence. Every photo taken on a modern iPhone is 6 times larger and more detailed than the original iPhone, and the screen quality lets you actually see that detail. Even a so-called ugly photo posted to Instagram today looks 100 times better than the best filtered photo posted in 2010. So this trend of calling today's use of Instagram ugly or anti-aesthetic is really kind of infuriating when you look at how far we've come. And listen, I get why there were so many people striving to curate their Instagram grid that reflected an unrealistic lifestyle. As a visual person myself, who loves design and photography, that kind of mid-2010s curation was comforting. It's escapism, simple as that, like looking through Architectural Digest all the perfectly staged Frank Lloyd Wright homes that you'll never be able to afford. It's wish fulfillment you can dip into and fantasize about, where your brain just shuts off for a while. And as with most things, fuck me, dude. I'm gonna... If I had a gun... As with most things, though, they wear out their welcome, and the semiotics and symbolism becomes perverted and bastardized, warped into something grotesquely transparent and vapid. especially when so many people commodified their personal style and sold it back to the masses. You know, the thing that maybe gave you a unique voice that's now the voice of many, and that uniqueness is diminished with every transaction. Capitalism. The era of Instagram filters absolutely got a lot of people into photography and maybe other forms of art as well, but it also encouraged a lot of dog shit copy-paste content that lacked any craftsmanship or distinctive character. In a perfect world, the masses wouldn't have to wait for a techno corporation to develop an app that made the creation of art accessible. We'd have those opportunities offered freely, and participation would be made a priority. Unfortunately, that's not the utopia we live in, so I don't want to fully discount things like Instagram and how it encouraged a generation to take up photography. But it's also a platform that makes decisions based on capital and user engagement, and rots your brain, that has done a lot of harm and turned every form of art into a monetization opportunity. I am, however, thankful that there's been a movement toward rejecting normality and conformity. I mean, you could argue that the trend toward ugly or anti-aesthetic content is the new norm now, but I don't see such reviled reactions to it. Something new will replace it if that happens, especially as technology advances and the barrier to entry lowers. Maybe we'll see a trend back to 2015 content creation. I mean, maybe not, but you never know. I mean, I personally know a few people who still post like that, who have tens of thousands of followers and get like 5 likes on any given photo. So, yeah, it's not happening. A bigger issue with Instagram and these filters is that digitizing the feel of instant film or tintype sucked the soul out of the real thing that existed in physical space and made its creation prolific and banal. Just because something is prolific doesn't mean it's any good, and just because you could take countless photos of your cat didn't mean we needed countless photos of your cat. The more you have of something, the less important and meaningful it becomes. And the treatment applied to digital photos became more important than the context and composition of the subject matter. With the current trend of unfiltered snapshots, they're rightfully not treated with as much care because they're just a collection of intangible ones and zeros. They're a dispassionate triviality meant to be consumed more or less and forgotten, not coveted. They're now created with the same amount of energy as should be paid to them. Very little. It feels like the consequence of online aesthetic appeal has reached an equilibrium with how much consideration should be paid to them. And I see more and more people treating their social media presence and content creation on Instagram with less and less regard, which is a healthy change. The only reason we're not just outright deleting our accounts is because it'd be like throwing out your parents' family photo albums. Our entire lives exist on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok now, for better or worse, and we just can't justify deleting all those memories of burritos and cats, so many cats and shoes, just junk. It's just junk. Delete your Instagram, I guess, guys. It's stupid. I maybe lost the plot there at the end. That's the video. Thanks so much for sticking around. If you made it this far, that means you're special. Thank you for all the continued support. Be sure you like and share and subscribe and comment. Those are the rules on this channel now. If you made it this far, you gotta do all 4. You can sign up for notifications too. I guess that's a 5th thing, but that one you don't have to do so much. I am in the community section all the time, and I'm gonna kill that bug one of these days. Oh my god. Giving updates about the channel. Please go follow me on Instagram. It is at Harland Spinks. Twitter, it's at MyDadBody, which I don't really use that much anymore because, well, we all know why, because. But yeah, go do those things. And until next time, vanish.